What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for not a Best Armies of Warhammer 40k. We're actually going to do something a little different this week. The regularly scheduled show will be out tomorrow. Instead, we just finished the Las Vegas Open 2025, the second Las Vegas Open of the year because of its new October timeframe. This was a highly publicized event, the largest singles event in North America, with almost 600 players attending, and we got to watch live streams both from Tabletop Live, Wargames Live, and the official Warhammer 40k channel. An absolute immense amount of coverage for one of the season's biggest events. And what I want to do is talk about the winning list. An absolutely insane 250 model Recon element guard list that was able to go undefeated over 10 rounds and win the event. So as we did last week talking about the London Grand Tournament, today we're going to be talking about the list, the matchups that it played in, and what exactly makes it so good. And we're going to do that just after a word from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by AdeptRoll. AdeptRoll's been a huge supporter of the channel for a while, so I'm excited to talk about them and their new updates. For those who don't know, this is a dice probability calculator app that can give you quick and easy access to expected dice results at your fingertips. So if you're wondering about particular unit builds, or you want to know what the best course of action in a particular game state might be, you can use AdeptRoll to very quickly get those results by importing unit profiles and quickly spitting out expected damage. This can help you smooth your army list building or give you insights into the game. And their latest update takes into account a ton of player feedback, improving things like unit profile imports, making it easier to import your datasheets and their weapon stats into the dice calculator, a full modifier and ability section to more easily input all types of attacker and defender special rules, a wider selection of results to grant you a deeper understanding of the results, as well as a new text summary to more easily understand the math you're looking at in English. So follow the links down in the video description to get access to AdeptRoll today. And big thanks to them for sponsoring the video. Now, the winner of the event was none other than Nemo the Fish. And if you've been watching the channel for a couple weeks, that might be a name you recognize because Nemo is actually the current T5S2 season champion for T5S2 Season 9. That's the online tournament series that I run last season. We had just about 600 players, essentially the same number of people as Las Vegas Open, actually. And Nemo played through the entire year-long season, got to the top 16, and then beat everyone in his top 16 games in order to go undefeated and become the champion. And he has done the same at LVO with a very similar variety of the list. Now, fortunately for me, that means that I've watched a ton of Nemo's games, so I actually have an intimate familiarity with this list. Obviously, not as much as the player himself, but I can discuss it with at least a little bit of authority. Now, first of all, let's talk about the Recon element detachment. This detachment has a ton going for it, and in a style of list that is bringing a maximum number of scoring units, it's actually incredibly strong. Now, part of the reason is for the survivability buff that it gives its units. It gives you a save characteristic improvement while you're benefiting from cover, and permanent cover if you are outside of cover normally. So if you're out in the open, most guardsman squads are going to improve a 5+ save to a 4 thanks to the cover bonus. If you are gaining cover either from a special ability or from being inside a ruin, it's going to improve your save to a 3 to a maximum of a 3+. Now, notably, this mostly doesn't stack with the take cover bonus from the order, which gives you an additional +1 save up to a maximum of 3+. However, take cover will still protect you if you are not otherwise benefiting from cover. It makes you a baseline 4+ save that can then get the out in the open cover bonus to bring you to a 3, or it gives you the save bonus in melee. Meaning that basically against all non-cover ignoring ranged attacks, the entire army is essentially a 3+ base armor save for essentially every situation it's going to matter for. Now, there's also a bunch of ways to get cover naturally, which we'll talk about momentarily when we discuss the units inside the list as normal. But when you're considering an army that is over 200 models strong, that 3+ save, while it sounds kind of banal, is actually really difficult to chew through. When you start thinking about your math when dealing with these huge guardsman units, and you consider, well, most of the time I'm going to be AP 1 or 2, I'm going to be forcing guardsmen either to a 6-up save or ignoring their save entirely. This army is largely saving on 5s or 6s in that point, meaning they could be cutting your damage as much as 30%. And when you need to be killing all of these squads in order to reliably prevent them from scoring, because they're then going to reanimate, get back to objectives, and continuously force you off your own objectives, it gets really difficult to stop it from doing what it needs to. Now, importantly, the other benefit of this army is the Astra Militarum army ability and a couple of special interactions with it. The army has an enormous number of orders available to it. Whenever it needs to, it's going to be able to improve either its survivability, movement, or damage output with different orders on the units it requires. Importantly, that means that while the army looks largely like it is coming in at a base movement of 6, that actually means a movement of 9, because most of these units are going to get move as they're pushing up the table. If they need to actually kill enemy units, they are also either going to get +1 to hit or additional attacks from first rank fire, second rank fire to just overload their targets in a mass number of saves. Nemo has said in the past that he fears a lot of Space Marine armies and armies with similar output to them that can target these specific units and then absolutely overwhelm them with enough firepower to one-shot them. And so he brings a lot of Space Marine killing weapons, especially like plasma guns in most of his units, which benefit from that first rank fire, second rank fire, and allow you to basically just chew through high armor save, mid toughness units with extreme prejudice. Any lower model count, high armor units will typically get inundated in enough guardsmen that they simply won't have the opportunity to ever take objectives or be useful in the game. Now, in addition to that, the list of stratagems for Recon Element is incredible. Importantly, there's a combination of 3 or 4 that are particularly strong. The first one is Draw Them Out. It's a platoon-locked reactive move, ends a normal advance or fallback move. You can move 6 inches. This allows you to move away from enemies that are trying to get an angle to clear your entire unit in one go, or allows you to blank incoming chargers. So if your opponent has a large, high-impact melee unit that's going to try to come in and clear 1 or 2 of these guardsman units, you can simply make their charge difficult or impossible with Draw Them Out. You can also combo that with Tanglefoot grenades, subtracts 2 from the charge roll of the charging unit. So between that and Draw Them Out, you can have a melee unit walk up to outside engagement of you, so just outside of an inch. You walk 6 inches directly backward, and then give them -2 to charge, meaning that you now have to roll a 9 to get into that 1 inch. So in particular situations, you can really restrict the efficacy of aggressive melee units that would normally be able to clear out your front lines, and then counterattack them with an overwhelming number of plasma guns and other shooting that can kill them easily. On top of that, we also have Courageous Diversion to protect against ranged armies. This targets an infantry or a mounted unit and gives you a 6+ feel no pain and -1 to hit against any unit as long as that unit is the closest eligible target, meaning the unit itself is -2 to be hit as long as it's the closest target to the attacking model, and every other unit in your army that is farther away than that one is, as long as the attacking model can see it, is also -1 to hit. So, ideally, this is used on a unit that is pushing up in the center of your army, up in the middle of the table. That unit's going to spread out to basically cover your advance, and for most of your opponent's shooting phase, provide -1 to hit to all of their attacks until that unit is dead or reduced in such a way that attacking models are no longer closest and have that unit visible. So while we have a lot of anti-melee protection from the reactive strats that we just discussed, we also have a reasonable amount of anti-shooting protection that is then compounded by the strong save characteristics of all of the infantry in the army. The stratagem then also importantly has Scramble Field, which gives a unit an Omni Scrambler's aura, so even in situations where you think you can get around its ability to reactive move by deep striking near it, they're simply going to Scramble Field you so you can't drop in that area as well. And there are some additional synergies with Scramble Field that we'll discuss when we move on to the list, which I guess is now, so let's do that. So the list itself is relatively straightforward. Nemo is playing an enormous number of infantry. He is including 1 Scout Sentinel, which is largely in there to blank the opponent's Bring It Down draw. So if you draw Bring It Down and your opponent has no vehicles, you're able to redraw the card. However, if there's 1 Scout Sentinel that's screening out the backline or doing an action somewhere, you now have to try to go kill that Scout Sentinel. And oftentimes the Scout Sentinel will be kept safe until that card draws out. Now, obviously, the downside is that this list basically gives up Call the Horde as soon as you draw it in most situations because it has so many large infantry units, which is typically not the case for many armies that do give up Bring It Down. So you win some, you lose some. The Scout Sentinel is largely in there to help out that one draw. Now, on top of that, we have 4 units of 20 Cadian Shock Troopers, 2 units of Catachan Jungle Fighters, 4 units of 10 Death Corps of Krieg, and 2 units of 20 Death Corps of Krieg, our maximum allowed field allowance of Death Corps of Krieg units. We have 2 units of Attilan Rough Riders. These guys are going to be our melee counterpunch and can serve as the closing blow on a lot of large, heavy targets. So the army isn't totally helpless against heavy vehicles that are high toughness characteristic. The Attilan Rough Riders can go in with high strength Melta lances with lance, hit on 2s, wound most things on 3s or 4s, and potentially do the finishing amount of damage to a tank or a Titan or something like that. The Rough Riders are also a relatively fast and aggressive disruption piece, so in the late game, they can also be given an order like Duty and Honor to get +1 objective control and act as an objective holding piece. Oftentimes, what the army will do is use one of the Attilan Rough Rider units early, either to kill a unit or disrupt the enemy on an objective, and then use Scouting Outriders to put another one into strategic reserve, as long as it's wholly within 10 inches of a battlefield edge, which it will be in the early game. You can do that for free because the army also includes Ursula Creed, and then that unit, because it didn't begin the game in strategic reserve, can come in off of the table edge or rapid ingress on battle rounds 4 or 5. When most reserve units would be forced to come in at battle round 3, these guys can ingress either bottom of 4 or top of 5 to then move up and disrupt a bunch of objectives, kill some units, and prevent the opponent from scoring at the end game. Now, the pièce de résistance here is the character selection for the army. That includes 3 Cadian command squads, 3 Cadian Castellans, Gaunt's Ghosts, and the aforementioned Ursula Creed. The Cadian command squads have Cadia stands, which gives their entire unit the benefit of cover if you are controlling an objective. Given the fact that the command squad itself ambiently improves the OC characteristic of the entire unit by 1, most of these guardsmen are base OC 3 and can also be ordered with Duty and Honor to become OC 4, which means that in almost no circumstances are these guys not controlling the objective that they are currently in range of. That then gives you the benefit of cover, which triggers the Recon element detachment ability, which gives you +1 save, bringing you these guys to the basically permanent 3+ save that we were discussing previously for them. On top of that, the unit also then provides its Master Vox to the Cadian Castellan. This allows your officers to issue orders up to 24 inches, and the Castellans have a base 2 order value. So all of these little units in the army can be issued orders from really far away thanks to these Cadian squads sitting on the back line. They're extremely difficult to interact with, very difficult to kill, and between the Castellan and the platoon commander can issue an order to themselves as well as to 2 other of the 10-man Catachin or Death Corps squads. The Castellan also gives the unit sustained hits 1, which is huge on a massive number of lasguns that this unit is bringing, and also fall back and shoot. So while you would normally expect that once you get stuck into melee, you get around the Tanglefoot grenades and the reactive moves, and you finally get to grips with these guys, they're going to be locked in melee and forced to take a turn off so you can hit them multiple times, but the Castellans just allow you to fall back, regenerate your plasma guns back into the unit, and then kill whatever was engaging them. Gaunt's Ghosts are also an incredibly important unit. The big combo here is the use of Scrambler Fields alongside them. As long as the controlling player disallows any unit from getting within 12 inches of the Gaunt's Ghosts, they can't be shot or charged for obvious reasons. They have a lone operative ability, and you can't charge things outside 12 inches. Obviously, the response to that is using close deep strikes or deep striking units to drop close enough to attack them. However, you can use Scrambler Fields on the unit itself to prevent enemies from dropping near them. So this is exactly the same reason that a Phobos Librarian in an Infiltrator squad is good. You cannot drop within 12 inches of this unit to shoot them. If you're outside 12 inches, you cannot charge them, so the unit is entirely uninteractable if you target them with Scrambler Fields. When with the ability to jump around the battlefield and provide this effect, this can be backbreaking to an army that's trying to use reposition mechanics in order to push enemies on forward objectives. On top of that, Gaunt's Ghosts have the ability to issue orders at the end of the movement phase because they do so whenever they arrive onto the battlefield. So one thing that the list often does is get around the 1 order at a time restriction. While a unit can only be affected by a single Astra Militarum order from voice of command at any one time, if you ever issue it a second order, it's going to drop off the first order and the second order will replace it. This allows you to do things like issue Duty and Honor to get additional OC characteristic on your units, steal an objective that your opponent was contesting that unit's now in range of, move forward, and then issue a second order to do more damage or be more survivable. Similarly, you can use move, move, move to get additional movement, move up the battlefield, then drop Gaunt's Ghosts next to that unit and issue them, again, something like first rank fire, second rank fire, or take cover to do more damage or be more survivable. So you essentially get the benefit of 2 orders at the same time. Now, this list over the course of the game is actually going to play really aggressively. Early on, it's going to try to prevent shooting on most of its units, and then force its smaller 10-man units down its opponent's throat, essentially asking the opponent if they want to overcommit resources into killing little units of 10 Death Corps of Krieg. If at any point you don't kill the units of Death Corps of Krieg, their metapack's going to regenerate D3 models, probably wrest control of the objective with the use of Duty and Honor for a bonus leadership and objective control, and then maintain a huge lead on primary. If you do overcommit, you have to commit hefty infantry sweeping units to the fight, you then can push the Cadian shock trooper units forward, use God's Ghosts to replace their order, and use their impressive shooting, sustained hits from the Cadian Castellan, plus charging after a 9-inch move thanks to move, to put their enormous sum of objective control onto opposing objectives. All told, these units come in at, I believe, 26 models, and those models are between 2 and 4 objective control apiece when affected by duty and honor, meaning that the unit all in is, I think, 98 OC, which it turns out basically no other army in the game can match that. So if all 20 of them are on an objective, that you just have it. The Cadian shock troopers then objective secure the objective the next turn. If you don't kill them, they're going to return D3 models back to the unit from the med packs in their command squads, and the same thing goes for the Death Corps of Krieg, who can potentially regenerate D3 plus models thanks to the multiple med packs included in their larger units. That allows you to regenerate your plasma and melta guns back into your units after they're destroyed, and allows you to just constantly overcharge the plasma guns and use them kind of recklessly, and then regenerate them if your unit doesn't die. And in the case of Death Corps of Krieg, that can also apply hit and wound bonuses once the unit is suitably depressed. So this army kind of functions a little bit like Necrons, where you're essentially required to one-shot the entire unit. If you don't, they're going to start regenerating. In some cases, they can pull themselves back and regenerate multiple times, and in some terrain setups, they can create a situation where you kill all of the models in line of sight. There's no more models for you to target because the rest of the unit is hiding. However, if they stay within 3 inches of an objective, they can just regenerate back to the objective in the command phase in order to retain control of that objective, potentially obsec it, and score a tone of primary. So that is the list. It is absolutely brutal if you don't have a huge number of infantry sweeping attacks. So a lot of this list is going to come down to your ability to execute it. As long as you don't run out of time or make any huge maneuvering mistakes with the army, it should score a high passive volume, and your opponents match up into it. If they have an enormous amount of infantry sweeping, big, hefty, high-efficiency blast weapons with high AP characteristics to punch through your cover, or ignore cover helps as well, then you may be able to clear enough of these models in order to kill it. However, I will mention that it's actually kind of difficult to remove the entire army within the time frame allotted for a game. Normally, players will be allotted somewhere between 1 hour and 15 and 1 hour and 30 minutes per game, depending on the exact timing restrictions that you're playing with, and oftentimes rolling enough attacks to kill 220 plus infantry over the course of a game ends up timing you out, especially if you're trying to play around all the reactive effects that the Astra Militarum can do, whereas the Astra Militarum army is very large, but relatively straightforward. So a lot of times what's going to happen is they're simply going to keep pushing forward, keep charging your units, combat slingshotting their models onto objectives, and just trying to depress your score on primary. I will mention, as I've talked about before, that I have streamed several of Nemo's games, especially over in the T5S2 Invitational. I will link the playlist to that down in the video description. If you want to see exactly how powerful this list can be on Tabletop Simulator, you can go check it out over there. But as many people asked, Nemo also, of course, owns this list in real life and took it to LVO. So let's talk about the matchups that he played and what had a chance to beat him as he went through his circuit. Now, in round 1, he was up against Thomas Ferrante, who was running Shadowmark Talon Raven Guard. Now, I will mention that in this case, the LVO did rule that Raven Guard were going to get the +1 to wound from Oath, which in most cases here doesn't matter that much because largely they're just wounding this army on 2s, but in some cases, for things like the Vanguard veterans, it could potentially have helped their matchup a little bit. Now, this is basically the stock standard Shadowmark Talon list that we've been seeing. It has Aethenshawn, Caven Shrike, a Hunter's Instinct captain to go into a Vanguard veteran squad, a Coronal Susurrant combi lieutenant to CP tax enemies, 2 units of Devastators, 3 units of Inceptors, and 2 units of Vanguard veterans to attach the jump pack characters, plus some utility. We've seen this list a million times. However, this list does have a lot of really powerful effects when dealing with this style of recon elements. The big one is the Centurion Devastator squads. Now, these guys have las cannons, which seems like an absolute disaster of a weapon option into an army that is composed entirely of individual wound infantry models. However, a big part of the Centurion Devastator's damage output is their Centurion missile launcher, which I think goes underrated when in discussions with the Centurion Devastator squad. The number of times I've seen the missile launcher alone one-shot an enemy, especially with all of the bonuses that you can give these things, it is crazy. And in this case, these guys are firing 6d3 blast attacks at a high strength, high AP, and multi-damage. So with Oath of Moment bonuses, the +1's AP that you can gain from Shadowmark Talon, these guys can strategic reserve around the side of the table. Doesn't matter if you can't set up within 12 inches of enemies because your range is 36, so who cares? And you're going to get 6d6 plus 30 attacks into a unit of guardsmen, since you're going to be +5 into the units of Cadians that have additional command squads attached into them, since they're above 25 models. And if that's your Oath of Moment target, or they're on an objective so you'll get hit rerolls, it's likely that you will simply kill that entire unit in one shot, assuming that the cover saves don't go against you. And that is a huge boon for this army. Now, the downside is that a lot of the other units in the Recon element list are very good at killing Space Marine profiles, so things like the Vanguard veterans are going to die pretty quickly, so you have to kind of play them out perfectly. So this matchup can certainly be lost by the Recon element guard player. However, in this case, it wasn't quite enough. Nemo, in his interviews after the event, said that his opponent unfortunately made a couple of misplays, left a couple openings for the guard to get up in scenario, and Nemo was able to win that matchup a convincing 91-45. I should mention, though, that he was, I believe, Thomas's only loss for the entire event. So Shadowmark Talon continuing to do well.
The Shadowmark Raven Guard round 1. That list is kind of a challenge because it turns out when 6 to 9+ models have blasts, and I'm running these grossly large 26-man units, and then they look at you and they go, I rolled a 7 on the dice, so that's only 70 shots, and you're like, wow, okay, I guess.
That put him into round 2 against Ozzy Nomak, running Adeptus Custodes. Now, Custodes does have a high volume of melee attacks, which is really what you need against these styles of Cadian armies if you are trying to engage them in melee. The downside is, of course, the anti-charge and anti-melee stratagems that the Recon element can use. So you can basically throw Tanglefoot Grenade back at the Adeptus Custodes army. If you played in 9th edition, you probably know how good that feels. Prevent them from getting easy charges into you in situations where they can bring the full might of their 5-up critical, sustain, reroll, high AP melee attacks to bear. If you can prevent them from getting to grip with things like the Custodian Guard squads, you can make it difficult for the Custodian army to remove entire units. On top of that, each of these Custodian Guard squads is worth about 23 guardsmen, and so each one of those that even come forward and kill a unit of 10 guardsmen is simply going to most likely be killed by massive amounts of shooting from the other guardsmen, trade down, and then lose additional value for the Adeptus Custodes player. So this, while Custodes do seem like they have the number of attacks to kill a guard army like this, actually seems like kind of a disaster of a matchup. And that was certainly shown by the scores, Nemo winning this game 100-26. Now that moved him on to the Militarum mirror match against Tyler Jones. Tyler was playing a combined arms list that was, as the name suggests, focusing on a wide variety of different units. This included several Rogodoran tank commanders, a couple of Leman Russ Vanquishers, which are largely useless in this matchup, alongside several Kazrakin squads in Tauroxes and Bulgrin squads to hold down the middle of the table. The downside here is, of course, the Rogaldorns and the Vanquishers being not super useful. The Rogaldorns do have multiple blast weapons. However, if the Recon element is able to engage multiple units early, which can be a real downside for Astra Militarum armies, very few Militarum armies can deal with engagement very well. The Rogaldorns can't fire their guns into melee, which means that they suddenly get restricted on targets, and if you're dumping an entire Rogaldorn into, let's say, 10 Death Core of Krieg that they might not even kill if you're applying any hit penalties to them, that can be an absolute disaster. On top of that, the Bulgrin will go down relatively quickly to the mass shooting that this army is bringing, so even if they have the attack volume to kill it in the middle, they're only really going to get potentially one turn of doing their thing before they're killed by mass lasgun and plasma fire. And similarly to the Custodian Guard squads, the more elite Kazrakin are going to trade down pretty heavily. From there, you're left with a couple of Lemuros Vanquishers that don't have the attack volume to deal enough damage to this Recon element to kill them, and things are looking pretty bad for you. That was another 100-point win for Nemo. However, his opponent scored relatively high at 67 and projected this Recon element into round 4. This was against Blood Angels, being piloted by Zach Kerstetter. Now, this was a much closer game, and Liberator Assault Group certainly has the capacity to clear out this army in melee. It also has the breadth of charging units to not be quite as hamstrung by Tanglefoot grenades as we would see Adeptus Custodes, and the speed to actually close that distance through reactive moves. So this can be a tough game. We do see a couple of kind of dead draws in this matchup. There are 2 Gladiator Lancers inside the Liberator Assault Group army. While these guys do actually bring kind of a high volume of shooting, it is unfortunately AP0 shooting, so it's not hugely useful even against its Oath of Moment target, and the Laser Destroyers might as well not exist in the matchup. The army was bringing a 6-model unit of Sanguinary Guard, as well as 2 5-model units of Death Company Marines, and a ton of jump back infantry intercessors, so it had the ability to engage along a wide front line and actually contest the smaller guardsmen squads on objectives. The questionable part is whether or not it has the sustain to actually continuously fight the army while being fallen back and shot into by Castellan squads. However, if you do stage aggressively, force your opponent to have to deal with your units that could potentially kill him in melee if they push forward to engage with your long threat range, high volume melee attacks, you can construct a situation where the guard army can't play in the sprinkler as well as it can against things like the Custodes and the Astra Militarum that we discussed in previous rounds. And that was certainly the case because Zach was able to score 70 points and hold Nemo down to an 87. However, wasn't quite able to contend with the massive number of infantry that the Militarum army was bringing. And that pushed us on to round 5, where Nemo was up against Kyle Grundy playing a Retaliation Cadre Tau Empire list. Now, given the fact that Tau has wide access to ignore cover, they do feel like a pretty solid answer to this matchup. They have the capacity to grant ignore cover thanks to marker lights to basically every one of their attacking units, and they certainly have the number of attacks required to clear out tons and tons of these guardsmen. The downside, of course, is that their attack volume can be relatively low. In this case, Kyle was playing a lot of things like Fire Knife and Sunforge battlesuit teams that only attack a couple times. And while they did have a couple of gun drones, that's not really the attack volume that they need. There were Pathfinder squads, as well as Riptide battlesuits, and one Star Scythe battlesuit, which is incredibly important, as well as a Fire Warrior strike team. So unlike many of the more standard Montka or Cao Yan builds that are focusing more heavily on things like gunships and Riptide battlesuits that don't necessarily have a ton of attack volume, this army certainly has what it takes to potentially deal with something like this recon element. A big downside, of course, is the fact that the AP bonuses and strength characteristic bonuses that you're going to be getting from the Retaliation Cadre don't matter too much in this matchup, outside of potentially buffing some of your burst cannon shooting. And as soon as that Star Scythe battlesuit team commits, it's immediately public enemy number 1 for the entire Militarum army. And it's going to eat so much plasma fire that it's probably going to be combat ineffective relatively quickly, with the rest of the army being kind of unable to deal with the massive number of guardsmen that are going to be stealing their objectives. I will mention as well that many Tau armies and Retaliation Cadre especially don't deal very well with being engaged. While battlesuits can fire into melee, they don't really have the opportunity in Retaliation Cadre to fall back and shoot as normal, so they're only restricted to firing into their own melee and add a -1 to hit penalty, assuming they don't have support systems, which really stifles their ability to maintain presence on a lot of objectives and stop the Militarum from being able to push up score on their expansion objectives. The Riptide battlesuits are the exception to this. They can basically do whatever they want at any time. However, they're only 3 models, and being forced to constantly fall back in order to target what they really want to every turn can really limit the angles that they can get onto important targets. It's important to note as well the existence of scrambler fields. If you can use good scrambler fields into a Retaliation Cadre, you can turn off a lot of their detachment bonuses, and in some cases prevent units like their Star Scythe team from shooting at the units that they particularly want to use. So even though they can get sustained hits too and a bunch of bonuses against large units, alongside their AP bonuses against non-monsters and non-vehicles, if you're forcing them to shoot into Death Corps of Krieg units that will just trade for a very valuable Star Scythe team, and then see the Star Scythe team get killed by plasma gun shooting on the subsequent turn, that's probably not going to go very well for you. And that moves us on to round 6, the first round before the top 16 cut. Now, in this case, Nemo was up against Dan Miloro running a Rubricate Phalanx. Now, according to Nemo himself, he has played this matchup with Dan several times, including at the Challengers Cup that occurred last week. And this is, in fact, not the only time he will play this matchup in this event.
Specifically shouting out Dan Maloro, who was on T-Suns. He was playing 30 Scarab Terminators, and that list made me cry because so we played each other last week at Challengers Cup, and it was a 10-10 draw. And then I played him in the 6th round. We drew, and Shadow Round paired again. And so it was 3 rounds of just looking at someone who I cannot shoot them, I cannot kill them, and all I have to do is just pray to God that I stand on circles better than they do. And that's kind of what it boiled down to.
Those Scarab Terminators are incredibly difficult to interact with from this Astra Militarum army. Part of that is the existence of Revenge of the Rubrique, which allows the units to fire back at an enemy each time a sorcerer model is destroyed. And each of these Scarab Terminators includes an aspiring sorcerer inside the unit, as well as a Terminator sorcerer. So they each allow potentially 2 of these interrupts to happen. So, for example, the Militarum could turn around, fire a boatload of plasma shooting at one Scarab Terminator squad. It immediately assigns the saves for those shooting onto its sorcerer, kills its own sorcerer, and then triggers the Revenge of the Rubrique either on that unit or another unit to fire back at the offending target and probably kill them, which allows them to actually generate the attack volume necessary to clear through all of these guardsmen. On top of that, the Scarab Cult Terminators do have an impressive enough melee profile that you aren't necessarily benefited by just engaging them willy-nilly. They're going to be able to hit back hard enough that they'll certainly kill 10 guardsmen, and there's a non-zero chance they'll kill a larger number, and then they can use Ardent Automata to just fall back and still shoot and charge anyway, allowing them to constantly be utilizing the massive number of attacks that they have. So each of these units is capable of killing 20 to 40 guardsmen a turn, and potentially even a similar number on the opponent's turn. Now, the downside is that these Scarab Cult Terminators don't have easy access to ignore cover innately. There are some units in the army that do, including a unit of Rubric Marines with Warp Flamers and a Soul Reaper cannon, which is definitely beneficial. However, the Scarab Cults themselves typically have high enough AP values with their Inferno guns that it doesn't matter. And in addition, if you need to kill something, you can use Twist of Fate in order to give yourself AP buffs to get through the high save characteristic of the Guardsmen. All that allows this army to potentially table this Astra Militarum army, and even more so if the Militarum ever actively try to push forward and engage or kill these Scarab Cults. Now, that still means that Nemo has such a volume of models on the table that he's able to spread out over the entirety of the battlefield, control so many objectives, and constantly be scoring his points that his score is going to be high regardless. And in many situations, if you can't jail the army or kill it quickly, it's going to be able to score a minimum of 70 or 80 points. And that's essentially exactly what we saw occur. Nemo, in his round 6, was able to draw his game a natural 76 to 76, which is a wild result, an exact draw, but that put him into round 7 for the top 16 cut with a technically undefeated record. Now, both Nemo and Dan Miloro were at the same record when they got to that pre-cut game, which means because they drew the game, they were almost identical tiebreakers when the event then cut to top 16, meaning that these two players then paired with each other a second time and had to replay the matchup. Now, while the previous game had been on Take and Hold, a primarily objective holding mission that the Rubricae are able to depress the Militarum score on by simply killing them off of objectives, round 7, the first game in the top 16, was played on Terraform. Terraform allows you to perform an action to essentially lock in a passive objective score on a particular objective. And one thing that this Militarum army is absolutely phenomenal at doing is performing actions. It has tons of tiny individual units that are able to get movement bonuses in the command phase to then push forward and take objectives. And Terraform, if you're able to take an objective in the movement phase, complete the action in the shooting phase, then scores for you immediately at the end of the turn. If the army is constantly either holding objectives against the relatively middling objective control characteristic of the Scarab Cult army, and or engaging those units so that they're not able to perform actions, or simply forcing them to perform a Terraform action, which then stops them from shooting their massive number of Bolter and Soul Reaper cannon shots into these guardsmen, means that the Terraform objectives can score multiple times for Nemo in a single round, which, if he's able to utilize that to his advantage, allows him to push up his score almost exponentially, even while not engaging with the Scarab Cult Terminators, which I think is what he did, because he was able to just barely win this game in a ridiculously high scoring 96 to 91, which is one of the highest scoring non-draw results I've ever seen. Absolutely insane. Unfortunately, this game was not caught on stream, but I kind of wish it was, because it looks like it would have been absolutely wild to watch. Now that moves us on to the quarterfinals game, the top 8 of the event. And Nemo was up against Durante Pozzini running a Kauyon Tau army. Now, as we've talked about in the past, Tau does have the tools to deal with the mechanics of Recon Element, but it has trouble finding the actual attack volume to do so. As long as Recon Element doesn't play too aggressively and give them too much to shoot at any one time, a lot of times Tau ends up not being able to leverage its volume of attacks unless it has units like Starsize Battlesuit Teams, which again are largely going to trade down into these large units. They're going to kill a bunch of guardsmen turn, and then it's likely that they're going to get picked up by return shooting the next turn. Now, in this case, Durante was playing a Kauyon list that was focused very heavily on gunships and Riptide battlesuits, which simply do not have the attack volume to be able to kill this army. We've watched this matchup progress a couple of times, and unfortunately, it's very difficult for Tau. They don't have a lot of shooting to clear out the Recon Guard before it hits them, and it's difficult to prevent the Militarum infantry units from charging them, slingshotting, and taking their objectives. Tau also doesn't tend to have a hugely high OC characteristic, so oftentimes a couple of guardsmen touching an objective is enough to take it away from something like a Riptide battlesuit or a Piranha holding onto it.
No, the thing with Tau, right, is and Foy knows that it's terrible for the same reason. It's like, yes, he ignores cover. He also only shoots 40 shots a turn. And so it's like, yeah, I don't get good saves, but he doesn't kill me, even if
you have great matchups into the whole group.
Now that put the army into the semi-finals, in which Nemo was paired against Folger Piles, the current 40k world champion, playing an Eldari Warhost. Now, Eldari does have a lot of tools to deal with high model count armies. It has units like Warp Spiders that have massive number of ignore cover torrent attacks. They have good Overwatch. They have units like Dark Reapers that have, again, mass numbers of ignore cover shots, and characters like Jane Zara that have a ton of high value melee attacks. And with the volume of attacks that Eldar can bring, it does pose a danger to the Guard army. That said, the platforms on which Eldar are bringing those attacks tend to be relatively high cost infantry units, which is almost exactly what these guardsmen units want to be fighting against. The Eldar army does not have high defensive characteristics, and they do not have an infinite number of these units that are able to kill multiple guardsmen. So, while Folger did play this game basically immaculately, two things were against him. The first of all, just the profile matchups between mass lasgun shooting and Eldari defensive profiles is brutal. Watching 20 guardsmen with a bunch of orders and leadership effects stacked on top of them shooting into aspect warriors was ruinous to these expensive Eldari units. On top of that, Folger also went first in this game. That's extremely bad because the guard player only needs to hold several of its units back in reserve for the bottom of round 5, and it's able to push forward and grab those points in order to win. Now, one thing that kept Folger in the game for a while was the mission, which was Purge the Foe, which allows players to score from killing enemy units in addition to holding objectives, meaning that the normal objective pressure that the Militarum army is able to provide is not quite as impactful as it is in most missions. And that allowed the Eldari to push forward really aggressively in the early game, kill an absolute immense number of units, and bring the score relatively close on primary. However, they were always fighting a losing battle because at the end of the game, Nemo had perfect control over primary objectives. Whether a player kills more units is under the control of the second player, and because of bottom round 5 scoring, the second player will also score the primary objective for holding objective markers on the battlefield at the end of the game as well. So all that Nemo had to do in this case was keep the score relatively close going into battle round 5, and then rapid ingress a unit of Etilin Rough Riders to take an objective, push forward his remaining guardsman squads to take several more objectives, ensure that his secondaries scored out, and score a minimum number of points in order to win. This matchup is incredibly difficult at a baseline. The mission does allow Folger a little bit of leeway. However, I think he would have much preferred going second in order to gain his own control of that end of game scoring metric. He certainly has the attacks to kill this army. However, doing so while also fighting into a deficit on the scoreboard is very difficult. And while he played it very well, this entire game was live streamed over by our friends over at War Games Live. He did eventually go down to a very good draw of secondaries at the end of the game, unfortunately knocking out the world champion from the LVO finals. And that qualified Nemo for the grand finals, where he was up against Tyler Stice, who was rocking Deathwatch. Now, this game was streamed over on the official Warhammer channel, so we got a peek at how it was going. Unfortunately, there weren't any player mics or anything like that, so we didn't get to see all of the interactions. However, we did get a look at how the attrition fight was going, and unfortunately, this is another instance of a situation where Deathwatch are wholly unprepared for the style of army that Astra Militarum are bringing. While they do have, kind of like Tau in many cases, a couple of powerful tools in this matchup, including things like Dragonfire rounds to give units ignore cover, the reality is that Deathwatch kill teams simply do not have the attack volume to fight this matchup by themselves. Tyler was bringing a Mark Hurdle style of list, so in this case it was focused very heavily on 2 units of Deathwatch veterans, as well as a couple of Terminator squads and some Indomitor kill teams. The Indomitor kill teams were bringing Flamestorm Gauntlet aggressors, which definitely helped, but they are typically low volume, high impact shooting. So while the Flamestorm gauntlets might kill 5 to 10 guardsmen with their shooting alone, the rest of the unit is only killing a handful, and that's not enough to prevent the guardsmen from just engaging you. On top of that, Deathwatch have very few ways to innately fall back and operate normally, so as soon as those Indomitor kill teams commit to the battle, they immediately get engaged and never get to shoot their guns again. Now, Tyler played around this pretty well by keeping his Indomitor kill teams relatively safe from being engaged and instead using things like his Terminators and his Deathwatch veterans to fight over the center of the table early, but with about a quarter of his army essentially out of the fight, because it's not really the unit that you want to be fighting with in that case, he didn't really have the attrition to defeat the massive number of guardsmen pushing at him. On top of that, he also went first in this case, so Nemo was able to hold things back relatively defensively in the early game, not give the Deathwatch too many opportunities to really leverage the power of Tome of the Ectoclades to get multiple Oath of Moment targets, and actually potentially make something happen by shooting multiple units off the table on turn 1 or 2. He pushed forward in the late game and basically just bowled over the entire Deathwatch army. It also super doesn't help that everything in the Militarum army has high efficiency plasma shooting, which is basically exactly the profiles that you want to kill mass Deathwatch veterans, which are essentially very expensive tactical marine defensive profiles. Plasma shooting is an almost literally perfect profile match into them, and so any of those converted attacks from essentially free guardsmen is killing really, really high value Deathwatch units, which you super don't want to see. But that placed Nemo the Fish as the LVO 2025 champion, able to go 9-0-1, 10 rounds, no losses in order to win the event. Huge congratulations to him, and it's cool to see this army continuing to do well off of the digital space where we saw him in the T5S2 Invitational and now over into IRL play. However, obviously Nemo has a pedigree of GT wins under his belt with armies of this style, so he is incredibly good at piloting armies like this. So let me know down in the comment section what you think about this army. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to Adept Roll for sponsoring this video, and stay tuned for a regular episode of Best Armies in 40K where we'll go through the massive number of other results we got from the weekend. I'm also going to be breaking down other lists from the top 16 as well as other large events on my regular live stream shows this week. This weekend was one of the largest we've had for Warhammer 40K, especially in North America, for a really long time, and so we have a lot of list data to sift through. I'll see you there. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.